Ladies and gentlemen, let's zoom in on level 1 questions. We've already alluded to that. It means it's extraction of evidence from sources. So in other words, the learners get answers from the sources. They don't think anything. It's the selection and organization of relevant information from sources. The candidate is expected to find the answer in the source. So in other words, you don't think in level 1 questions. The answers is in the source. Now, let's focus on the wording which is used to ask these level 1 questions. List 4 events in the source, identify 2, select 2 words, state 2 pieces of evidence in the source, quote evidence from the source. What according to the source? So that's where the answers are, meaning the phrasing of these questions, you get the answers in the source. Now define the historical concept. Remember, I said earlier on in the definition of the term, it is not there in the source. So the definition of the term is not in the source. So in other words, that's where you have to think, because that definition is not in the source. If I can give an example, they will say define the term Cold War in your own words. It's always 2 marks the definition of the term. Let's quickly focus our attention on level 2 questions. Remember, level 2 questions, we said, is an interpretation of evidence from sources. That's what I said. Do you understand the English that is in the 4 sources? That's what it means, interpretation. They explain information gathered from sources. They underline evidence from sources. The questions are phrased like this: explain why. Learners must explain why. In other words, this is not an easy task, because now a learner thinks. Comment on why. Explain what messages are conveyed by the cartoon. Explain the implication of this phrase. So, the example that comes on mind on level 2 question, what was implied by Winston Churchill in his statement when he said an iron curtain has descended across the continent 2 times 2 4 marks. So that is implication, what is implied. So it's very, very challenging for our learners to answer level 2 questions, because they need them to understand the English that is used in the sources. Now let's focus our attention once more on level 3 questions. If we look on level 3 questions, learners, they interpret and evaluate evidence from sources. They engage with sources to determine usefulness, reliability, limitation, and bias. Remember how these questions are phrased. The question will say, comment on the usefulness of this source when you are researching about the successes of the Marshall Plan. Comment on the limitation of this source when you are researching about the impact of the Battle of Quito Carnival. So it's 2 times 2, 4 marks. They compare and contrast interpretation and perspective presented in sources and draw independent conclusions. So they draw independent conclusions. So learners will get a question will phrase that: how does the information in source 1A support the evidence in source 1C regarding the successes of the Marshall Plan? So that what it means, they compare and contrast interpretations. Let's look at the conclusion. This slide is emphasizing on the fact that we've got level 1 questions where learners they extract evidence from sources, where the candidate is expected to find answer in the source. So we indicated that learners they don't think much in level 1 question because the answer are in the source. In level 2 questions, we said learners they interpret evidence from sources. Remember, I said that's where most learners are having challenges because they don't understand the English that is used in those 4 sources. Level 3 questions, we said learners they interpret evidence from sources. They compare and contrast interpretation and perspective presented in sources. Let me elaborate once more. I've indicated the fact that on level 1 questions, it is more or less 14 marks. But I don't want to say 14 marks, I rather say it's 12 plus 2. Because it's 12 marks where you strictly get the answers from the source. That 2 marks for level 1 is a historical interpretation which is not there in the source. Define the term Cold War in your own words. Define the term amnesty in your own words. That is definition of a historical concept, which will always be 2 marks. We look at level 2 questions. That's where we said more or less is 20 marks. And then we already indicated the fact that learners have challenges in answering level 2 questions. They cannot interpret evidence from sources. They struggle to answer questions like what messages are conveyed by this source. In other words, they cannot interpret the visual sources because they will get 4 marks on visual sources. What messages are conveyed by this source? Always on level 2 questions is why. Explain why. 2 times 2, 4 marks. And most learners, they score 0 on level 2 questions. Remember, earlier on, I made an example of Winston Churchill's speech, what is implied by Winston Churchill in his speech when he says an iron curtain has descended across the continent in 1945. A learner is expected to provide 2 responses. One response, it will mean that Winston Churchill implied that in 1945 the world was divided into 2. There was a Western Bloc and an Eastern Bloc. Then a learner will be able to score 2 marks in that particular response. Another response, that statement implies that in 1945, Stalin had successfully spread communism to Eastern Europe. That is, the interpretation of that speech, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Now let's concentrate on level 3 questions, where we said that it's an interpretation of evidence from sources. They compare and contrast interpretations and perspective presented in sources. Remember, we said more or less that is 16 marks. I already indicated there, there's 8 marks, which will always be the last question, which is a paragraph question. The other 8 marks will come on what we call as level 3 skills: reliability, usefulness, biasness, as well as comparison of sources. Now let's quickly look on this question, which is 8 marks, the paragraph question, because that's where learners are struggling. In order for a learner to write that paragraph question, a learner must have an addendum in his or her hand. In that addendum, he must be able to summarize. For example, let's talk about the Cold War. He must be able to say, source 1A deals about the formation of the Marshall Plan in 1949. So this source indicates that European countries were invited in New York to receive the Marshall Plan. Also, Russia and the satellite states were invited. Now, after summarizing what source 1A is all about, he must acknowledge that all this information is from source 1A. Then a learner can move now on source 1B. Also on source 1B, he must summarize. In other words, he is using his or her own words. He is not using the wording that is in there in sources. That's what it means, interpretation of evidence from sources. Then he can say that in source 1B, this is a Russian source, which indicates that the Marshall Plan was not a success. That information is from 1B. Stalin viewed Marshall Plan as an interference in domestic affairs of European countries. Also, Stalin indicated that these countries were given Marshall Plan, but they have to repay back these loans with interest. So all this answer is from source 1B. In other words, in each and every source, a learner must try to use his or her own wording. He is not rewriting sources verbatim. He is interpreting evidence from sources. Let's also look at comparison. Also on that skill on level 3, this does not necessarily mean that in comparison, all learners will get similarities. Learners may get similarities as well as differences. For example, of similarities, how does the evidence in source 1B supports the information in source 1A regarding the successes of the Marshall Plan? So that one is similarities. So let's look now at the difference. The question will say, how does the evidence in source 1D contradicts? Obviously, they will write differs in brackets so that a learner can know what the word contradicts means. Contradicts, it means differs. How does the evidence in source 1D differs with the information in source 1B? So in other words, learners must prepare to get similarities and differences when they are writing the source-based questions. But it is easier if learners keep on practicing. In other words, you cannot write source-based questions without practicing. Learners must keep on practicing. We know that there's a saying in English that practice makes perfect. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to source-based questions. We know that they are challenging to many of you. Thank you very much.